blood dripping on polished marble. A gasped breath echoing in a dead-silent room full of ruthless men. When a battered woman collapses into the arms of the city's most feared crime boss, his icy heart skips a beat. He sees the bruises. The underworld is about to burn. The November rain lashing against the frosted windows of the cramped Brooklyn apartment sounded like a death knell. Celine Anderson stood before her cracked bathroom mirror, her trembling fingers clutching a damp beauty blender. She dabbed thick, heavy concealer over the angry violet and yellow canvas blooming across her collarbone and the delicate curve of her left cheek. Every breath she took felt like jagged glass slicing through her lungs. 2 broken ribs, maybe 3. She didn't dare go to a hospital. In New York City, the police are the ones you call for help. But for Celine, the police were the monsters in the dark. Detective Arthur Rollins, a highly decorated officer in the NYPD's organized crime unit, was the city's golden boy. To the press, he was a crusade of justice. To Celine, her fiancé was a sadistic terror who ruled her life with a heavy fist and a loaded service weapon left casually on the dining table. He had beaten her last night because a neighbor, a young college student, had helped her carry her groceries up the stairs. "If you ruin my reputation, Celine," Arthur had whispered into her ear as she lay bleeding on the hardwood floor, "I won't just bury you, I'll bury your little sister too." Swallowing the bitter taste of bile and terror, Celine buttoned her starched white blouse all the way to her throat. She tied a black silk bow around her neck to hide the handprints Arthur had left there. She had to go to work. If she missed her shift at the Labyrinth, Manhattan's most exclusive and secretive underground VIP lounge, Arthur would notice the missing cash from her purse. He meticulously audited her tips. The Labyrinth was a sanctuary for the city's untouchables, billionaires, corrupt politicians, and the men who ruled the shadows. Celine was a premier bottle server. She kept her eyes down, her mouth shut, and her tray balanced. That was the rule of survival. Tonight, the air in the club was suffocatingly thick. The heavy bass of the ambient music vibrated against Celine's fractured ribs, sending stars shooting across her vision. The floor manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Beatrice, pulled Celine aside the moment she clocked in. "You're in the Sovereign Suite tonight," Beatrice whispered, her tone laced with a rare thread of anxiety. "No mistakes, Celine. Douglas Scott is holding a sit-down with the Chechen syndicate. Pour the drinks, clear the ashtrays, and act like a ghost." Douglas Scott. The name alone made the city's elites sweat. He was the head of the Scott family, a 34-year-old phantom who had rebuilt a dying Mafia empire into a ruthless corporate syndicate. He was known to be calculating, fiercely private, and entirely without mercy. Celine nodded, her face a pale mask of obedience. She gathered a silver tray, holding a bottle of Macallan, 1926, and 3 heavy crystal tumblers. As she walked down the dimly lit, velvet-lined corridor toward the Sovereign Suite, a fresh wave of agony radiated from her torso. She had tightly bound her ribs with athletic tape, a desperate measure that was now restricting her oxygen. Her vision blurred at the edges, the corridor tilting slightly. She dug her manicured nails into her palm, using the sharp sting of pain to anchor herself to reality. Just pour the drinks. Just survive the night. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the suite. The atmosphere inside was glacial. At one end of the long mahogany table sat 3 heavily tattooed men, speaking in hushed, harsh Russian. At the head of the table sat Douglas Scott. He was a man carved from marble and shadow. Impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal 3-piece suit, his dark hair was neatly styled, but his eyes, a striking, piercing steel grey, held the predatory stillness of a wolf watching its prey. He wasn't speaking. He was simply listening, his large, ringed hand resting casually over the silver handle of a cane he never seemed to lean on. Celine stepped into the room, her sensible black heels silent on the Persian rug. The Chechens paused their conversation, their eyes raking over her with blatant, predatory hunger. Douglas didn't look at her. He merely tapped his index finger on the table, a silent command for the liquor. Celine approached Douglas's right side. Her hands were shaking. She tried to steady them, clamping her jaw shut as another agonizing spike of pain shot up her spine. She reached out to place a tumbler before him. Suddenly, one of the Chechen men slammed his fist onto the table, shouting a curse in Russian, entirely displeased with the terms of the negotiation. The sudden, explosive noise sounded exactly like the gunshot Arthur had fired into the ceiling 2 nights ago. Celine flinched violently. Her body, already pushed past its absolute limits of trauma, malnourishment, and oxygen deprivation, simply gave out. The silver tray slipped from her numb fingers, the crystal shattering against the floor. Celine's knees buckled. The room spun wildly, fading to pitch black. She braced for the harsh impact of the edge of the mahogany table, knowing it would shatter her skull. But the impact never came. A blur of charcoal wool and the scent of bergamot and gun oil enveloped her. Douglas Scott moved with terrifying, fluid speed. Before her head could strike the wood, his strong arm wrapped around her waist, hauling her upward against his solid chest. In the chaotic motion of the fall and the sudden catch, the top 3 buttons of Celine's stiff white blouse tore open. The black silk bow unraveled. Silence slammed into the room. The Chechens froze. Douglas's personal guards, standing in the shadows, had their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. But Douglas wasn't looking at the Russians. He was staring down at the woman, limp in his arms. His eyes tracked the torn fabric of her blouse. The heavy concealer had rubbed off against the lapel of his expensive suit, revealing what lay beneath. Ugly, mottled bruises painted her porcelain skin in shades of horrific violence. Dark, distinct fingerprints formed a suffocating ring around her slender throat. Beneath the torn fabric, the harsh lines of white athletic tape wrapping her fractured ribs were visible, stained slightly with a bloom of fresh blood where a sharp edge of bone had rubbed raw. Douglas's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The cold, calculating businessman vanished, replaced by something ancient and incredibly dangerous. Celine fluttered her eyes open for a fraction of a second. She saw the steely, terrifying gaze of the Mafia boss looking down at her battered body. She weakly tried to pull her ruined collar up, a pathetic gasp escaping her lips. Douglas's large hand gently caught her wrist, stopping her. His voice, a low, lethal baritone that vibrated through her aching chest, cut through the silence of the room. "Who hurt you?" Celine couldn't answer. The darkness rushed back in, pulling her beneath the waves, and she went entirely limp in the arms of the most dangerous man in New York. "Meeting adjourned. Get them out of my sight." Douglas's voice brooked no argument. He didn't even look up as he scooped Celine into his arms, lifting her effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing more than a ghost. "Mr. Scott, the territory—" One of the Chechens began to protest, insulted by the abrupt dismissal. A heavy, terrifying silence fell over the room. Silas Reed, Douglas's imposing, broad-shouldered underboss, stepped out of the shadows, his hand resting casually on the butt of a suppressed Glock. "You heard the boss," Silas said quietly, his voice dangerously smooth. "The exit is behind you." Douglas strode out of the Sovereign suite, ignoring the frantic whispers of the club staff. He carried Celine through the private rear exit, stepping into the freezing rain where a fleet of armored black Maybachs idled. "Call Dr. Aris," Douglas ordered Silas as he slid into the back seat, keeping Celine's unconscious body braced against him so the movement wouldn't jar her injuries. "Have him at the penthouse before we arrive. Tell him to bring the trauma kit." Silas raised an eyebrow in the rearview mirror, but knew better than to question his boss. "Done." During the 20-minute drive to the Scott stronghold, a sprawling, fortified penthouse overlooking Central Park, Douglas couldn't take his eyes off the woman in his arms. He didn't know her. He had seen her poured his drinks a dozen times over the last 6 months, a quiet, invisible phantom who never made eye contact. He had preferred her professionalism. But looking at her now, truly looking at her, a strange, dark fury coiled tightly in his gut. Douglas Scott was a man who dealt in violence. He broke bones, he ruined lives, and he authorized executions. But there was a strict, unwritten code to his brutality. It was business. It was power. What he saw mapped across this woman's fragile body wasn't business. It was cruelty. It was the work of a coward. When they arrived, Dr. Samuel Aris was already waiting. They laid Celine out on the massive king-sized bed in the guest wing. Douglas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering skyline, while the doctor cut away Celine's ruined blouse and the blood-stained athletic tape. A sharp hiss of breath escaped Dr. Aris. "Jesus Christ, Douglas." Douglas turned. His eyes darkened at the sight. Without the clothing to hide it, the extent of her suffering was laid bare. 3 fractured ribs. One looks dangerously close to puncturing a lung if it takes another hit, Dr. Aris muttered, his professional demeanor slipping into disgust. Extensive soft tissue damage, burns on her left shoulder, looks like from a cigar or a cigarette. Malnourished, and these bruises on her neck. Someone tried to strangle her, likely within the last 48 hours. "Fix her," Douglas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I can bind her ribs properly and administer painkillers and fluids, but she needs rest, Douglas. Complete, stress-free rest. If whoever did this to her gets their hands on her again, she won't survive the next beating." Hours later, the storm outside had intensified. Celine swam through a heavy fog of morphine and exhaustion. Soft Egyptian cotton sheets cascaded over her, and a warm, crackling fire filled the room with a soothing amber glow. For a terrifying, disorienting moment, she thought she was dead. Then, she remembered the club, the tray, the fall. Panic seized her chest. She shot up in bed, ignoring the sharp protest of her ribs. Arthur. If Arthur found out she didn't finish her shift, if he found out she was missing. "I wouldn't move if I were you." Celine gasped, pulling the duvet tightly to her chest. Sitting in a leather wingback chair in the corner of the room was Douglas Scott. He had shed his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal dark, intricate tattoos winding up his forearms. He was swirling a glass of amber liquid, watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. Where am I?" she stammered, her voice raspy from the bruised vocal cords. "You're in my home," Douglas replied evenly. He stood up, walking slowly toward the edge of the bed. Celine instinctively flinched, shrinking back against the headboard. Douglas stopped instantly. He noticed the flinch. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but he kept his distance, placing his glass on the nightstand. "My doctor treated your injuries. You're safe here, Miss Anderson." Celine's eyes widened. "You know my name. I make it my business to know everyone in my establishments, especially the ones bleeding on my floors." Douglas leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on his cane. "I'll ask you one more time, the same question I asked you before you passed out. Who did this to you?" Celine's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't tell him. She absolutely couldn't. Douglas Scott was a criminal, but Arthur was the law. If she told a Mafia boss that a decorated NYPD detective was beating her, Arthur would use the police force to slaughter her sister. I fell, Celine lied, her voice shaking. Down the stairs of my apartment. It was an accident. I need to go home. Please let me go home. Douglas stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The silence was deafening. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. Silas, Douglas called out softly. The heavy mahogany door opened and Silas stepped inside, holding a manila folder. He handed it to Douglas and left the room without a word. Douglas opened the folder, flipping through the pages. Celine Ann Anderson, 24 years old, no criminal record, parents deceased, primary guardian to a younger sister, Lily, currently residing at the St. Jude Medical Facility for severe asthma treatments. Douglas paused, his eyes flicking up to meet Celine's terrified gaze. And currently engaged to Detective Arthur Rollins of the NYPD. Celine let out a choked sob, clapping her hands over her mouth. Please, please don't. Arthur Rollins, Douglas mused, closing the folder and tossing it onto the foot of the bed. A golden boy. A media darling. He's been leading task forces, raiding my eastern shipping ports for the last 3 months. The media calls him an untouchable hero. Douglas stepped closer to the bed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. But I know what he really is. I know he's on the payroll of the Falcone family. I know he's using a badge to clear out my territories so the Falcones can move their narcotics. And now, I know how he treats the woman he claims to love. Celine was openly weeping now, the morphine doing nothing to dull the sheer panic consuming her mind. If you touch him, if he even suspects I told you anything, he will take Lily out of that facility. He'll let her die, Mr. Scott. He told me he would. You have to let me go back to him. I have to pretend everything is fine. Go back to him? Douglas's voice cracked like a whip in the quiet room. He stepped right up to the edge of the bed, leaning over her. You think I'm going to let you walk out of my house and go back to a man who snaps your ribs for sport? You don't understand, Celine cried out, her fear overriding her common sense. He has the entire police force behind him. You can't protect me from the law. Douglas Scott let out a dark, humorless laugh that sent shivers down Celine's spine. He reached out, his large, warm hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed a tear from her bruised cheek. Little bird, Douglas whispered, his steel-grey eyes blazing with a terrifying, absolute certainty. I am the law in this city. Arthur Rollins doesn't know it yet, but he signed his own death warrant the moment your blood touched my floor. For 3 days, Celine Anderson lived suspended in a gilded cage perched high above the clouds on Billionaires Row. Douglas Scott's penthouse at 432 Park Avenue was a fortress of glass, steel, and silent, lethal men. Inside, however, it was a sanctuary. Celine was treated with a reverent, almost terrifying gentleness. Dr. Aris visited every morning, checking her ribs and adjusting her bandages. The penthouse chef, a quiet Italian woman named Rosa, coaxed her into eating rich, nutrient-dense broths and homemade pastas, slowly bringing the color back to Celine's hollowed cheeks. Yet, terror remained her constant shadow. Every time a door clicked shut, Celine flinched, expecting to see Arthur Rollins's shadow stretching across the hardwood floor. She knew the monster she was dealing with. Arthur was a narcissistic sociopath, hiding behind the shiny brass shield of the 17th Precinct in Midtown East. He wouldn't just let her disappear. His pride wouldn't allow it. On the evening of the 4th day, the storm broke. Celine was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapped in a thick cashmere cardigan, watching the city lights bleed into the twilight. The heavy oak door of the study opened, and Douglas walked in. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate ink of a crowned serpent winding down his left forearm. His face was a mask of cold, beautiful stone, but his steel-grey eyes softened fractionally when they landed on her. "How is the pain today, little bird?" he asked, his deep baritone sending a strange, unfamiliar warmth pooling in her stomach. "Tolerable," Celine lied softly, her fingers knotting together in her lap. She took a trembling breath. "Mr. Scott, I can't stay here anymore. You don't understand what he's going to do. If Arthur realizes I'm gone, he won't look for me. He'll go straight to Mount Sinai Kravis Children's Hospital. He'll take Lily. He has the legal guardianship papers he forced me to sign. He'll take her off the ventilator just to punish me." Douglas walked over to a crystal decanter on his desk, pouring 2 fingers of bourbon. He didn't look panicked. He didn't even look concerned. He looked dangerously serene. "You think so little of me, Celine," Douglas murmured, taking a slow sip. He set the glass down and picked up a sleek, black, encrypted tablet. He walked over and handed it to her. Celine's hands shook as she took it. The screen displayed a live security feed of a bright, sunlit hospital room. A young girl with pale skin and a tangle of dark hair was sitting up in bed, laughing as a broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit expertly lost a game of Uno to her. Celine gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Lily, Silas has been at Mount Sinai since the night you collapsed in my club," Douglas explained, leaning against the glass window, watching her face intently. "Arthur Rollins tried to walk into the pediatric intensive care unit yesterday at 3 p.m. He flashed his badge. He demanded to transfer her." Celine's heart stopped. "And he found out that the Scott Syndicate owns the board of directors at Mount Sinai," Douglas said, a lethal smirk playing on his lips. "He also found out that a team of my best lawyers filed an emergency injunction with the New York State Supreme Court, nullifying his coerced guardianship based on anonymous, heavily corroborated allegations of domestic terror. He couldn't get within 50 feet of her room without triggering a federal trespassing charge. Tears, hot and fast, spilled down Celine's cheeks. She looked up at the terrifying, ruthless Mafia boss standing before her. For years she had been drowning, screaming for help in a city of 8 million people, and no one had heard her. Now, the most dangerous man in the underworld had stepped into the freezing water and pulled her out. "Why?" Celine whispered, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this for me? I'm nobody. I pour your drinks." Douglas's jaw tightened. He stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them until he was standing just inches from her chair. He crouched down, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. There was no deception there, only a fierce, burning possessiveness that made her breath hitch. "You aren't nobody, Celine. You survived a monster for years to protect the only family you had left. That makes you stronger than half the made men in my organization," Douglas said quietly, reaching out to gently brush a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Arthur Rollins brought his filth into my city. He touched what belongs in my world. And in my world, men who beat women don't get to breathe the same air as the rest of us." Before Celine could process the weight of his words, the heavy doors of the study burst open. Silas strode in, his face set in grim lines. "Boss," Silas said, ignoring Celine entirely. "We have a problem. Rollins is escalating. He just used a heavily armed NYPD tactical unit to raid our shipping warehouses in Red Hook." He's claiming an anonymous tip about a narcotics shipment. Douglas didn't flinch. He slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his shirt. The gentle protector vanished, and the apex predator returned. Did he find the narcotics? No. Because we don't traffic narcotics, Silas replied dryly. But he planted 3 kilos of cocaine in the manager's office and arrested 5 of our men. He's making a public spectacle. The press is already there. He's trying to smoke you out, Douglas. He knows you have her. Celine panicked, standing up too quickly and wincing as her ribs flared with agony. I have to go to him. If I show up, he'll drop the charges. He's doing this to get my attention. Sit down, Celine, Douglas commanded, his voice carrying an undeniable weight. He turned to Silas, a dark, terrible smile curving his lips. Rollins is desperate. He's losing control, which means he's making mistakes. Call Leo. Tell him to leak the Falcone financial ledgers to the Southern District of New York. Every offshore account, every bribe Rollins ever took. Silas nodded. And Rollins? Tell our inside man at the 17th Precinct to relay a message, Douglas said smoothly, picking up his cane. Tell Detective Rollins that if he wants his runaway bride, he can meet me at the abandoned Navy Yards terminal at midnight, alone. The Brooklyn Navy Yard was a desolate wasteland of rusted shipping containers and crumbling concrete, shrouded in freezing fog. Midnight brought a bone-chilling dampness that clung to the skin. Detective Arthur Rollins stepped out of his unmarked police cruiser, his hand resting heavily on the Glock 19, holstered at his hip. He was a handsome man, with golden blonde hair and a charismatic smile that charmed the media. But tonight, his face was twisted into an ugly sneer. He felt invincible. He had the badge. He had the city's backing. He thought Douglas Scott was just another thug who could be bullied by a uniform. "Scott!" Arthur's voice echoed off the rusted metal husks of the warehouses. "I know you're here. Bring her out, and maybe I don't burn the rest of your pathetic empire to the ground." Footsteps echoed in the darkness, slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. Douglas emerged from the fog, flanked by Silas and 4 men wielding suppressed automatic weapons. Douglas wore a long, black wool overcoat, his silver-handled cane tapping rhythmically against the wet concrete. He looked like a king arriving to inspect a slaughterhouse. "Detective Rollins," Douglas said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the distant harbor waters. "You are trespassing on private property." Arthur laughed, pulling his weapon and pointing it directly at Douglas's chest. "I don't need a warrant for scum like you. Where is she? Where is Celine?" "Celine is resting comfortably in a bed that costs more than you make in a decade," Douglas replied smoothly, not even blinking at the gun aimed at him. "She is healing from the fractured ribs and the strangulation marks you left on her. She will never be returning to your squalid little apartment, and she will never look upon your face again." Arthur's eyes twitched with manic rage. "She belongs to me. If you don't hand her over right now, I'll call in a strike team. I'll tell them you're holding her hostage. You'll be dead before sunrise, Scott." "Will you?" The voice didn't belong to Douglas. From the shadows behind Arthur, 3 black SUVs rolled forward, their headlights cutting through the fog. The doors opened, and a dozen men stepped out. But they weren't Scott's men. They were heavily armed FBI agents, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with SDNY. Leading them was Captain Thomas Briggs, Arthur's commanding officer at the 17th Precinct. Briggs looked at Arthur with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Arthur froze, the gun trembling in his hand. "Captain, what the hell is this? I have Scott exactly where we want him. He's holding a hostage." "Drop the weapon, Arthur," Captain Briggs ordered, his voice echoing with finality. "It's over. We have the ledgers. We have the wiretaps from the Falcone family complaining about your exorbitant extortion fees. We know you planted the cocaine in Red Hook tonight." Arthur's face drained of colour. He looked from Briggs to the impassive face of Douglas Scott. The realization hit him like a freight train. The raid, the escalation, the taunts. Scott hadn't been backed into a corner. Scott had expertly lured him into overplaying his hand, forcing him to act so recklessly that the federal authorities could finally trap him. "You set me up," Arthur hissed, stepping backward. "You gave them the files." "I merely facilitated justice," Douglas said coldly. "Something you forgot how to do a long time ago." Arthur panicked. He spun around, aiming his gun wildly at the federal agents. "I'm a decorated officer. You can't do this." Before Arthur could pull the trigger, Silas moved. A single, suppressed gunshot coughed in the damp air. Arthur screamed, dropping his weapon as his kneecap shattered. He collapsed onto the wet concrete, writhing in agony, his golden boy facade entirely destroyed. The FBI agents moved in, kicking the gun away and hauling a sobbing, bleeding Arthur to his feet, slamming him against the side of the SUV to read him his rights. Douglas watched the pathetic display for a moment before turning his back on the detective. "Enjoy Rikers Island, Rollins," Douglas called over his shoulder. "I hear the inmates there have a special welcoming committee for dirty cops who beat women." Douglas walked back to his Maybach, sliding into the heated leather interior. As the car pulled away from the Navy Yards, leaving the flashing red and blue lights behind, Douglas pulled out his phone and dialed a secure number. Celine picked up on the first ring. "Douglas?" Her voice was breathless, trembling with anxiety. A rare, genuine smile touched the corners of the Mafia boss's mouth. "It's done, little bird. He's gone. He will never, ever hurt you again." A soft, choked sob of profound relief echoed through the receiver. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Douglas leaned back against the headrest, watching the glittering skyline of his city blur past the window. "You don't owe me anything, Celine. But when you are healed, and when you are ready, I'd like to take you to dinner. Properly this time, no trays, no hiding." Silence lingered on the line for a long moment. When Celine finally spoke, there was no fear left in her voice, only a quiet, blossoming hope. "I'd like that very much, Douglas." The city of New York was a brutal, unforgiving place. But as the sun began to peek over the East River, washing the towering skyscrapers in warm, golden light, the shadows finally retreated. The king of the underworld had found his queen, and the golden boy had been buried in the dark. Did this thrilling tale of dark romance, betrayal, and underworld justice keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Celine, find her strength, and Douglas deliver ruthless karma, smash that like button. Share this video with fellow Mafia romance addicts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more pulse-pounding, dramatic stories every single week. Drop a comment below with your favorite scene.